All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another fantastic book talk with the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I see some of you are still connecting to audio, so we'll give everybody just a minute or so to make sure that those connections are established. I'd like to thank everybody for showing up today and joining us. This is our first book talk of 2024. We've been going through a pretty busy museum cycle over here, so I do apologize for not having a book talk between. I think our last one was in November. And then now here we are in March already. I can't believe it. Just to remind everybody that we do have our security features enabled today. So nobody will be able to turn on their cameras and nobody will be unable to unmute themselves. If you do have any questions for our author today, please use the chat function here on Zoom. You can send those questions directly to me. Just like in all our previous book talks, I'll be populating the PowerPoint presentation with those questions and bring them up at the end so everybody can see them to include our author. And then also, lastly, I'd like to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in all of our free virtual programming, not just our book talks, but our trivia nights, our movie discussion nights, drink and draw events, all the fantastic virtual programming we get to do is because of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation. And this event is not only sponsored by the foundation, but also with support for the foundation coming in the memory of the Pat Finley family. So thank you to the Pat Finley family for their continued support, as well as the foundation for all the virtual programs that we get to do here at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Just before I start, I just want to remind everybody, I see everybody does have good connectivity now. If you have any questions for our author today, please submit those via the chat function right here on Zoom. I'll be taking those questions and putting them into a PowerPoint presentation. At the end of the program, we will get to those questions and answers. Speaking of questions and answers for our author today is Shannon McKenna Schmidt, and she's the author of the First Lady of World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt's daring journey to the front lines and back. She is also the co-author of two previous books, Novel Destinations and Writers Between the Covers. She's written for National Geographic Traveler, NPR.org, and other websites and publications. From 2010 to 2017, Shannon traveled full-time, first in the United States by RV and then backpacking around the globe. I'm extremely jealous. I could stand to do that for 7 years. She now lives with her husband in Hoboken, New Jersey. And she's here today, like I said, to talk with us about her newest work, First Lady of World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt's daring journey to the front lines and back. I won't give too much away about the book. I'll let Shannon do that. Shannon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric, for the introduction and for inviting me to be here today. And thanks so much to everyone joining us. I'm excited to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt and to share a lesser-known side of her as an adventurer and a traveler, and to highlight the pivotal part that she played during World War II. This story begins in August 1943, when Eleanor set out from New York City on an unprecedented journey. Keeping a low profile to evade the media, she flew to San Francisco on a commercial flight, which at the time took about 20 hours and required 2 refueling stops. Once in San Francisco, at an Army airfield, she secretly boarded a military transport plane. Traveling under the code name Flight 321, the plane was bound for the Pacific Theater, where the United States had been at war with Japan for nearly 2 years. Inside the plane, it was bare bones, it was loud and rumbling, it was unpressurized, it was freezing cold, and Eleanor shared the space with supplies and sacks of mail. By the time Eleanor set out for the Pacific, she had been First Lady for a decade. She was famous for her travels, or infamous, depending on the perspective, and she constantly made headlines for them. When Eleanor entered the White House in 1933, the American public got a First Lady the likes of which they had never seen before. Traditionally, First Ladies primarily stayed close to the White House, they oversaw social functions, and they did not take an active part in public life. But at the time Eleanor became First Lady, she was already well established in her own right as an educator, a political advocate, a writer, a speaker, and a traveler. Eleanor was an early advocate of commercial air travel at a time when it was thought that only the most courageous and athletic people were fit to fly. And she was friends with Amelia Earhart, and she wanted to be a pilot herself. This was not a woman who was going to be grounded at the White House. Eleanor created for herself a unique role that combined her love of travel, her wanderlust, with her sense of social responsibility. She decided that she could best help her husband, the president, by being his eyes and ears, his listening post, and by keeping him in touch with public opinion, which she said is the moving force in a democracy. Eleanor ceaselessly crisscrossed the country, inspecting New Deal initiatives, giving speeches, seeing and meeting people, and gathering information. And that information she used to exact change, either through her own means or by providing it to the president and his policy advisors. 1 year into his presidency, FDR asked Eleanor to go to Puerto Rico to investigate labor and living conditions. And the fact that she took a flight over water to get there cemented her reputation as fearless and unconventional. And around that time, she was featured on the cover of this general interest magazine and declared America's most traveled First Lady. As First Lady, Eleanor averaged an astounding 40,000 miles on the road each year. And yet, even for such an experienced traveler like Eleanor, the Pacific trip exceeded anything she had previously done, including a wartime trip to Great Britain the year before in 1942. This time, she would be on the road longer than ever before, traveling farther and at a faster pace, covering more ground, enduring more discomforts, and facing danger. Eleanor was heading into a theater of war unlike any other in history, one where fighting took place across great distances over water and on islands with harsh terrain. Life magazine used these aerial views of a globe to show its readers how the Pacific Ocean sprawls across nearly half the planet, transforming the area into what they described as the vastest single battlefield over which man has ever fought. Eleanor traveled for 5 weeks and covered 25,000 miles, a distance roughly equal to the Earth's circumference. She went to Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, through the South Pacific, and, at her insistence, into territory that was still under enemy air attack. Eleanor predicted that the Pacific trip would cost her deeply, both physically and mentally, and in fact, this turned out to be true. Early on in the research process for the book, I came across something that she wrote in an autobiography 6 years after the trip to the Pacific, and she said, "The Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free." And I found that statement so powerful and haunting, and that she said it so many years later. And it really compelled me to uncover what she experienced during her time in the Pacific. So why did she do it? Why did she commit herself to such an arduous undertaking? Eleanor was enormously driven to contribute to the war effort, and she continually looked for ways to do that. And some of the things that she wanted to do did not work out, which very much frustrated her. And she was convinced that her association with the White House would prevent her from doing any real job in World War II. Then her journey to Great Britain proved different. It was an important undertaking that was uniquely suited to her. She was world famous and well-renowned. She had the travel savvy, as well as the diplomatic skills, the people skills, the morale building skills, and the reporting skills. The trip was a resounding success. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was impressed with the way that Eleanor charmed and bolstered the British people, and he told her afterward, "You certainly have left golden footprints behind you." Eleanor's trip to the Pacific would draw on all those same skills, and it would require even more endurance and courage, which was exactly the kind of wartime task she wanted. Eleanor especially felt a sense of obligation toward the generation of young men being sent into battle. And a primary reason for the trip was to thank US troops herself and on behalf of the president, and to build morale. And in all, she addressed more than 400,000 troops throughout her time in the Pacific. The trip was also an informal diplomatic mission to allied nations Australia and New Zealand, and to see the war work that women were doing in those countries. And Eleanor added even more onto her plate by going as a representative of the American Red Cross and inspecting the organization's facilities in the region. She packed no civilian clothing, and she wore only Red Cross uniforms during the trip, which pared down her clothing and helped her adhere to a strict luggage limit. Furthermore, the trip occurred at a crucial time in the war. By the summer of 1943, the tide was turning in the Allies' favor in Europe and the Pacific. Eleanor felt that people were overly optimistic about the war's outcome and that they were becoming dangerously complacent. There were strikes at war production factories across the country. People were complaining about food rationing and shortages. And the trip would link the home front and the fighting front, reminding the nation that they could not give up on their duties until the war was won, and that any slackening in production risked the lives of the men on distant battlefields. For security reasons, the trip was kept secret for the first 10 days as Eleanor made her way from island to island through the South Pacific. Her first inspection stop was a U.S. Army outpost on Christmas Island. A speck of land so tiny she wondered why a large wave didn't come along and wash it away. Rumors are running rampant among the GIs on Christmas Island. They noticed that heightened security measures were being put in place, and they speculated that someone important was coming to visit. They thought it might be a troop of chorus girls, or perhaps the politician Wendell Willkie, who had recently made an around-the-world tour and written a best-selling book about it. They were expecting a VIP, and yet they were astounded when Eleanor Roosevelt stepped off the plane. FDR specifically asked Eleanor to visit Christmas Island and other islands along the supply and communications route linking the United States with Australia. It was vital to keep the route open and protected, and yet the men on these islands felt marginalized and distant from the fighting, and as if they weren't making enough of a contribution to the war. And FDR wanted Eleanor to assure them that he knew the valuable job they were doing. On Christmas Island, Eleanor set the rigorous pace that she would keep throughout the trip. After she got back, she was giving a speech, and an audience member asked her how many hours of sleep she got per night while she was in the Pacific. She replied that she could get by on 5, but that she didn't always get them. She went nonstop the entire 5 weeks, sleeping on army cots and rustic huts, traveling by jeep over rough terrain to reach isolated camps, and doing things like climbing a lookout tower on Christmas Island and getting an up-close look at a tank destroyer in Australia. Sorry, I apologize. I've had a bit of a cold. Eleanor visited Red Cross clubs. She dined in mess halls, getting up at dawn to breakfast with servicemen, and she walked miles and miles of hospital wards. She inspected everything from laundry rooms to artillery headquarters to a dentist tent in the Australian outback, where a serviceman was having a tooth removed without making a sound. He said afterward, "It hurt like hell, but with Mrs. Roosevelt watching, I had to act tough." Eleanor took every opportunity to speak with servicemen, finding out what they wanted and what they needed immediately and after the war. Eleanor was an expert at fact gathering. During her visit to Great Britain, an American reporter wrote in a London newspaper, "The best thing to do with Eleanor is to go through the necessary formalities and then just turn her loose. She can be depended upon to see everything there is to see and meet everyone worth meeting." In Bora Bora, instead of breakfasting as expected in the officers' mess, she surprised down the ranks by eating with the enlisted men, and she borrowed mess gear from an awestruck young serviceman. Not only is the First Lady in an active theater of war, she's reporting to the president and the home front while she's there. During her decade as First Lady, Eleanor achieved something else that was unique, building up an extensive network of outlets that she used to communicate with the American public, holding her famous women-only press conferences, giving speeches across the country, making radio addresses, and writing a 6-day-a-week syndicated newspaper column called My Day. The strict luggage limit I mentioned earlier, part of the reason she pared down her wardrobe by wearing the uniforms was because she lugged a heavy manual typewriter with her to the Pacific, so that she could keep writing My Day in real time, and copy was wired to her editor in New York. During World War II, Eleanor used her platforms to support the war effort and to help guide the nation, from urging women to seek employment in the defense industry to advocating for legislation to support veterans. She promoted the buying of war bonds and donating to the Red Cross Blood Bank, which was a new nationwide program at the time. The blood was turned into dried plasma and sent to the front lines, where it was kept in foxholes for use during battle. As Eleanor had been doing her entire time as First Lady, she used the knowledge she gleaned to advise on issues that otherwise might have been not have been known or fully understood. One example of this is how she prepared the nation for the fact that men would be returning home with disabilities in greater numbers than ever before. And she did this by sharing the story of a soldier she met on Christmas Island, whose leg was amputated after he was pinned beneath an overturned tank. Due to advances in medicine, like having blood plasma at the ready, if troops didn't die outright in battle, chances were they would live, albeit with physical disabilities. Eleanor advised that these men be treated not with pity, but with helpfulness and understanding. Eleanor used her platforms to buoy home front morale and to admonish when necessary, such as chastising Americans for believing enemy propaganda and doing Hitler's work for him. Eleanor also used My Day to help maintain the secrecy of the Pacific trip. For the first 10 days of the trip, she had pre-written columns, and the byline listed her location as being at home in Hyde Park, New York. Eleanor continued to make her way through the South Pacific until she reached the island of New Caledonia, where she ran into a roadblock. That roadblock was Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Forces and the man who would decide if she was allowed to visit the island of Guadalcanal, which was her ultimate goal of the trip, and it was still on the front lines. Admiral Halsey was not pleased to have Eleanor in the Pacific. He had nothing against her personally. He liked her. He admired her. What he didn't like were VIPs traipsing through his area and taking his focus away from the war, especially because he thought that these visits were usually superficial PR junkets or political gestures. All very practical reasons that he objected, along with the fact that he would have to put on a tie. When Eleanor arrived at his headquarters, Admiral Halsey brusquely shut down the suggestion of her going to Guadalcanal, telling her, "Guadalcanal is no place for you, ma'am." He did make a slight concession, saying that he would wait to make a final decision until after she visited Australia and New Zealand and returned to New Caledonia, and he would see what the status was of a current battle he was overseeing and whether or not he had the available fighter planes to escort her into Guadalcanal. Eleanor was devastated at this immediate shutting down of her request, and she did leave for New Zealand in really low spirits because she thought, given this initial reception, there was no way Admiral Halsey was going to agree to her going to Guadalcanal. So after 10 days of secrecy, Eleanor landed in New Zealand and news broke about the trip. There wasn't so much surprise that she turned up on the other side of the world, but that the trip had been such a well-kept secret. When Eleanor arrived in New Zealand, it was nighttime in Washington, D.C., and the switchboard at the White House began lighting up as reporters scrambled for the story. There was a deluge of media coverage, and, as with most of Eleanor's undertakings, controversy erupted. There was praise for what she was doing, and there was criticism. Newspaper editorials took sides, and people wrote letters to their local papers for and against Eleanor and the trip. The New York Herald Tribune ran side-by-side contrasting letters. One was from someone who lauded Eleanor, and the other was signed by disgusted citizen who demanded a congressional investigation into Eleanor's activities. Eleanor was often asked if the criticism she received troubled her or if it was hurtful or made her angry. She directly addressed the issue in an article titled "How to Take Criticism" that was published in Ladies' Home Journal. And ultimately, she concluded, "You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So you may as well do what you think is right and what you believe in." Eleanor definitely did not have time for the traditionalists, still lamenting not having a more conventional first lady. Some of these people wrote directly to the president to gripe about Eleanor, like Mr. and Mrs. George Rogers of Atlanta, who sent this telegram asking FDR to confine Eleanor more to the White House. Eleanor's unconventionality is one of the things that the New Zealand and Australian newspapers celebrated. Eleanor was familiar to New Zealanders and Australians because of news coverage during her time as First Lady, and her reputation as an advocate for social justice preceded her. A New Zealand newspaper said at the time of her visit, Mrs. Roosevelt is frequently described as the world's foremost female political force. She is the wife of a ruler, but her power comes from her influence, not on him, but on public opinion. It is essentially a self-made influence. No other president's wife has exercised anything like the same power, either in her own land or in the world without. Another New Zealand newspaper called Eleanor a great fighter in the cause of the world's freedom. They were particularly impressed that she was perhaps the only woman at whom Hitler screamed his denunciations. For years, Eleanor had been publicly speaking out against Hitler and Nazi aggression, and the Nazis noticed. A German newspaper threatened her by name, and Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, wrote in his diary, Mrs. Roosevelt is shooting her mouth off around the country. If she were my wife, it would be a different story. Eleanor was a presence on the global stage during World War II. She made 3 wartime trips overseas to Great Britain, the Pacific, and a year later to the Caribbean area. She was asked to make morale-raising radio addresses to women in Sweden, Brazil, France, and other countries. She was a voice to the Allied nations, so renowned and respected that she and what she stood for was a threat to the Axis. The media coverage during Eleanor's time in the Pacific was massive in part because her visit to New Zealand and Australia was a historic event. She was the first US president's wife to visit, and that she traveled there during wartime made it even more impressive to them. Her visit generated a level of excitement that was on par with royalty, even blocking traffic in Sydney. This clipping is from a scrapbook sent to Eleanor by the New Zealand government commemorating the trip. Some old-timers in Australia's capital, Canberra, thought that Eleanor being there even eclipsed the excitement of a royal visit, with a notable difference. They loved her informality. The Australians in particular cheered whenever Eleanor broke with protocol, like the time that she visited a cannery that prepared food for the troops, and she stood on a table in a dining hall to address the women who worked there. One of the most informal and delightful parties Eleanor attended was with US Army and Navy nurses at a Red Cross club in Sydney, where she spent a very happy half hour talking with them about their experiences serving in New Guinea. Eleanor told My Day readers that everyone at home owed a debt of gratitude to the nurses in the Pacific. They are not living very comfortably, she said. They are seeing daily sights that must try their fortitude, and yet she never heard a single one complain. Eleanor shared in My Day that if she were young enough, she would like to have been a nurse in the Army or the Navy because they most closely shared the men's experiences. After leaving Australia, Eleanor went off the grid again for security reasons, and the flight number was changed. She returned to Admiral Halsey's headquarters on New Caledonia, where she received some great news. She was going to Guadalcanal. Why the change of heart on Admiral Halsey's part? Eleanor won his support not by making arguments, but by the power of her example. Through his own observations, along with reports from other military personnel throughout the region and a tremendous amount of press coverage, he saw that her motivation was genuine and that this trip was no superficial PR junket. Admiral Halsey later admitted to being sorry for his original surliness, and allowing Eleanor to go to Guadalcanal was a sign of respect for her. Also, Admiral Halsey was shrewd. If all went well while Eleanor was on Guadalcanal, it would generate good publicity. And you need good publicity to keep public approval high for the war and to keep funding flowing. But ultimately, what it came down to, and why I think he allowed Eleanor to go to Guadalcanal, was that morale wins wars, and he could see the uplifting effect that her presence had on the troops. Here is this gruff, tough admiral, and he said that what he marveled at most were the expressions on the men's faces as Eleanor leaned over them in their hospital beds. He said most people came through his area, glanced into a sun parlor at a hospital, and left. Eleanor, meanwhile, as you can see in these photos, she went bed to bed comforting the wounded. And Admiral Halsey knew the importance of that. When he took over Guadalcanal, the command of Guadalcanal, he visited the front lines as soon as he could. And on his way back to his headquarters, he stopped at another island specifically to visit a naval hospital where he went bed to bed, comforting the wounded and talking with the injured servicemen. It not only buoyed their morale, it buoyed the morale of the men on Guadalcanal when they heard about it. Part of what made Eleanor so successful was her ability to connect with people, whether it was the Prime Minister of New Zealand or a wounded young soldier she met at a hospital in Australia. When she reached this young man's bedside, he handed her a long letter. She took out her glasses, she put them on, and she read the entire thing. She could see that this young man was distressed, and she ordered everyone, medical personnel, reporters, and the high-ranking officers who insisted on following her around everywhere to go wait in the corridor while she spoke with him alone. And this is one instance out of many during the trip that illustrates Eleanor's caring about the servicemen on an individual level. And Eleanor even went a step further. A practice she began in Great Britain was to keep logbooks of the wounded servicemen she met. In these logbooks, she recorded each person's name, his injuries, and where and how he received them, such as Second Lieutenant Leroy Mitchell, a bombardier in a B-17 who had a ruptured eye from being shot in the face during an attack by Japanese fighter planes in the skies over Papua New Guinea. Also recorded in the logbooks was the name and address of a family member for Eleanor to contact after her return. And she did contact the families. Letters took weeks to get to the Pacific and back, and to have recent firsthand news of your loved one from the First Lady of the United States was extraordinary. Although Eleanor called one serviceman's girlfriend and she hung up on her because she thought she was being pranked and she didn't believe it was the First Lady calling. So now, Admiral Halsey is fully on board with Eleanor's visit to Guadalcanal, and any misgivings he still had about her going were solely out of concern for her safety. Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands was the site of the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War. The stakes were high and the headlines were blunt. Jungle Island becomes the heart of Great Battle for the Pacific, and Solomon's Battle vital to Allies. Newspapers reported daily on the progress of the fighting, and Eleanor and the rest of the nation closely tracked what was happening on Guadalcanal. Finally, after 6 months of unfathomable hardship, the Japanese were defeated on what they called Death Island, and they relinquished control of Guadalcanal. Visiting there was a tribute Eleanor felt she owed to the men in uniform, to see where so many had lost their lives or received their injuries. And she had already met a lot of men who had been wounded on Guadalcanal during hospital visits in the United States and in the Pacific. And Eleanor's respect for the troops' sacrifices was deeply personal. All 4 of her sons were serving in various branches of the military on active duty, including her son James, a Marine who fought in the Solomon Islands campaign. And visiting Guadalcanal was also a personal test for Eleanor. She was concerned that she would be perceived as lacking courage if she weren't permitted to go. She told Franklin, "I simply never will face another hospital at home, for I will always feel that the men are thinking I was afraid if I do not go." In the early morning hours, under cover of darkness, Eleanor left for Guadalcanal in a heavily gunned U.S. Navy bomber, which flew with lights out to evade detection. She sat on a makeshift seat over the bomb bay, ears ringing and shivering in the dark. Despite the difficulties of the 3-hour ride, Eleanor was elated at achieving her goal. As the bomber closed in on Guadalcanal, 6 fighter planes appeared to escort it the rest of the way. As it turns out, Admiral Halsey's concerns about Eleanor's safety were warranted. Guadalcanal was bombed several nights before and after her visit, leading him to speculate whether the Japanese also had code breakers. With the manual typewriter Eleanor hauled around the Pacific, she kept a diary that was shared in installments with the president. And here in this entry, she described an air raid alert that sounded while she was on Guadalcanal. Along with the hospital staff and the ambulatory patients, she was taken to an underground shelter to wait for the all clear. And after the all clear sounded, she didn't miss a beat. She got right back to business going through the hospital wards. The danger associated with the trip didn't faze Eleanor. Even traveling in a military transport plane for 5 weeks was risky, as they weren't the most reliable aircraft. To save time, rather than design transport planes from scratch, the military modified heavy bombers. One pilot bluntly described a converted bomber to transport plane as an evil bastard contraption. The year before Eleanor went to the Pacific, a man named Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, a famous World War I pilot, was asked by the Secretary of War to travel to the Pacific and deliver a confidential verbal message to General MacArthur at his headquarters in Australia. And the navigation in the transport plane that Captain Rickenbacker was traveling in it malfunctioned, and they missed a refueling stop. And in fact, the fueling stop that they missed was an island that was originally on Eleanor's itinerary. And the plane was ditched in the Pacific. And Captain Rickenbacker and some other survivors were finally spotted and rescued after they had spent 24 days floating on a raft in the ocean. On Eleanor's return home, the planned route was changed at the last minute because of reports of Japanese aircraft in the area for retaliatory raids. Eleanor had courage in spades, and as I said, the danger didn't concern her. What greatly impacted her was the massive scale of suffering she witnessed. She said that one sees the results of the war in the hospitals. And Eleanor was a class act when she was going through the hospital wards, bed to bed, offering words of comfort or a joke. But she said that inside she was burning with resentment at what was being done to these young men. A particularly emotional experience for Eleanor was visiting a cemetery on Guadalcanal, walking along the rows and rows of graves, many of which were adorned with handmade crosses and mementos left by servicemen for their fallen friends. Eleanor wrote in My Day, "You think of the women's hearts buried here as well, and are grateful for signs everywhere that show the boys are surrounded by affection." She went on to tell her readers, "I have seen many a boy hospitalized because he went back for a buddy who was wounded. When you try to tell them of your admiration for their courage, they seem embarrassed." One boy said, "Shucks, you would do the same, wouldn't you?" All you can say is, "I hope so." Afterwards, Eleanor often thought about the cemetery on Guadalcanal, particularly when she heard someone spewing bigotry. As soon as they started to speak, she would envision the cemetery where men of varying nationalities, races, religions, and backgrounds who once fought side by side now laid together in death. Eleanor was extremely forthright when reporting back to the American public and making them understand the human cost of the war. In a radio address after her return from the Pacific, she told of a young man she met in a first-line hospital, so recently injured that he was still in the set of bandages from when he fell in battle. In that same address, she told people to stop complaining about food rationing and shortages because it was nothing compared to lying on your back in a jungle swamp while an enemy camouflaged in the trees took shots at you. In another speech, she recalled the shadowed eyes of the men who had endured the savagery of jungle warfare. Eleanor went to great lengths to understand jungle warfare, which was a new type of fighting for American servicemen. In Australia, she even participated in a training exercise in the jungle. And Eleanor had a reputation for wanting to see things for herself, and that's exactly what she did. She wished she had seen the training before answering a letter she received from a serviceman's mother. This woman was outraged that her son was being trained in the Louisiana swamps, which she thought was cruel and unnecessary. And Eleanor said, "I might have been able to explain to her that it was for her son's own safety in the future." Eleanor's final stop in the Pacific was Honolulu. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was the first public figure to address the nation. She was scheduled to broadcast her weekly radio show that same evening, and she went on the air as planned, giving an update about what was happening behind the scenes in Washington and offering an encouraging message to the American people. "Despite a clutch of fear at your heart," she told them, "I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears." This photo shows Eleanor on the battleship USS Oklahoma, which was torpedoed and sank at Pearl Harbor, taking 429 sailors down with her. At the time of Eleanor's visit, the Oklahoma had been raised from the harbor floor and it was being kept upright with cables, but it was not yet afloat. As Eleanor predicted, the Pacific trip took a huge physical and emotional toll on her. She lost 30 pounds while she was overseas, and after she returned home, she fell into a deep depression. A close friend of hers explained it by saying, as long as she had to keep going, her iron will carried her through, in spite of her deep horror at what she saw and the great sadness at the continued bloodshed and dying. As Time magazine pointed out, no other US mother had seen so much of the panorama of the war, had been closer to the sweat and boredom, the suffering. And yet the Pacific trip made Eleanor determined to work even harder, to see the war through and to strive for peace so that this carnage never happened again. A near-term goal was to see a support program established for returning servicemen. During all of the conversations with servicemen that Eleanor had in mess halls and Red Cross clubs throughout the Pacific, the things she heard the most were that they needed supplies to win the war and that they wanted opportunities for jobs and education after they returned home. Eleanor used the power of her public platform to help ensure that this was done, bringing pressure to bear on Congress. Legislation needed to be passed immediately and not after the war was over, both to assist the great number of men already returning and to boost the morale of those on the fighting fronts. As a soldier explained to Eleanor, and she shared this in my day, they weren't afraid of being killed or maimed. What they were afraid of is that when they finally returned home and began piecing their lives back together, that they would be made to feel like suckers for the sacrifices they had made. And the GI Bill of Rights was signed into law the next year. One of the most telling instances about the validity of Eleanor's trip to the Pacific was Admiral Halsey completely changing his mind. And he was not inclined to change his mind easily. And he said, she alone accomplished more good than any other person or any group of civilians who passed through my area. Due to the concern about the retaliatory raids on Eleanor's way home, the transport plane was detoured to Christmas Island, where she had begun the trip weeks earlier. When the inevitable controversy erupted over the trip, the soldiers on Christmas Island had Eleanor's back, and they took on her detractors in their troop publication. A GI journalist reported, her kindness and consideration brought this island of forgotten men very much back to life. Another said, it takes great courage to do what Mrs. Roosevelt is now doing, and you have to hand it to her. She has what it takes. During the dozen years Eleanor spent as First Lady, upending tradition and breaking new ground, her journey to the front lines most powerfully illustrates how dramatically she transformed the role. The Pacific trip exemplifies so much of what is admired about Eleanor: her courage, her compassion, her connections with people, her crusading for a better world. And it shows how important her leadership was during World War II. A reporter at the time described Eleanor's trip to the Pacific, and I believe this still stands, as the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made. Thank you all so much for listening, and now I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Well, thanks for that, Shannon. My goodness, that's just so inspiring. And I'm not going to start giving away questions, but that's just well, I don't want to get into to giving away the questions right out of the gate. What I want to say happens to deal with some of the questions that were asked by some of our audience members.
Okay.
Let me go ahead and get this up real quick. Give me a second here. I'm the one fumbling now with my technical skills. Here we go. The first question, Shannon. What was your inspiration to write this book about Eleanor Roosevelt? How did you get onto this topic and go, God, there's a lot of great stuff there. There's a book in this.
Well, actually, I talked a lot about my day, Eleanor Roosevelt's column that she wrote for 26 years. And there were about 8,000 columns total. And it was actually while I was reading a collection of my day that I came across a mention that she visited Australia during a tour of the Pacific Theater. And it was a fleeting mention, but it immediately caught my attention because I had recently been to Australia and New Zealand on that 7-year odyssey that you mentioned in your introduction. And I really connected with Eleanor Roosevelt, the traveler. And because travel was actually one of the reasons that Eleanor was considered an unconventional first lady.
Excellent. Um, what was your favorite part of doing the research while you were writing this book? Was there any particular thing that you came across? You're just like, wow, that's just like so amazing.
That's actually a great question. The heart of my research was done at the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York. And there is something there called the Pacific Trip File. And it's really like a time capsule of Eleanor's trip to the Pacific. There are things like a mileage log, a list of the crew members who flew her into Guadalcanal on the US Navy bomber. There are formal dinner seating charts. There are notes between FDR and Eleanor. And just to be going through that file and touching things that I knew that she had touched was just that was really an incredible experience going through this Pacific Trip file.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about documentation and archival material like that. And like you said, these are things that she had her hands on. So that it immediately provides that connection. That's one of the things I like about research as well. But that's really cool that you come across those sorts of things, and it just really lends itself to your spirit and your motivation to write something like this.
Yeah, and I had a moment at the FDR library, and I said to the staff, I said, wow, I said, I can't believe that you let us come here and touch these materials and go through this. And they said, no, they belong to the American people, which I thought was really kind of touching.
And they're absolutely right. That's why they create those institutions so that the American people can, go in and see what their leaders were doing, what people like Eleanor Roosevelt. Aside from the FDR, this kind of, this segues nicely. Aside from the FDR Museum and Library, where did you find a lot of your other materials for your research?
I drew on oral histories, memoirs of servicemen, Red Cross workers, and they were very instrumental in setting a lot of the scene. Another pivotal resource was a man named Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger was Eleanor's main escort in Australia, and he wrote a very wonderful memoir called Jungle Road to Tokyo. And that too was very instrumental in helping to set the scene of what it was like for the servicemen in the Pacific, because the Pacific theater was much more distant to people on the home front than, say, Europe. So part of what Eleanor was doing was bringing the Pacific theater back to them. And so I really tried to set the scene with that. The other thing that was critical were newspaper databases. Because there's a lot of like real-time accounts about what's going on. And one of the things, I just did a deep dive into some newspaper databases because I was like, I was driven and possessed to find out when Eleanor Roosevelt took her first flight. Like here she is. She's known for her travels. It's why she's partly considered an unconventional first lady. I just did a deep dive into newspaper databases, trying various keywords. And I finally discovered that she took her first flight in 1929 while she was the first lady of New York State. And she was asked to christen a research plane for a company that manufactured aeronautical equipment. And she said yes, on one condition. She said no flight, no christening. And that day she took a 20-minute ride in the skies over Albany.
And I'm not an aeronautical historian, but really aeronautics had not gone very far after that. Coming out of World War One. So the fact that she's brave enough to even step on these contraptions is kind of amazing.
It is. And you see some of these photos. She was also famous for taking a flight with a Tuskegee Airman in his plane. You see this, it's a little two-seater plane with the top open. It looks, kind of scary. Like you would have to be very brave to go up in that plane.
Next question, Shannon. Has any other first lady made this sort of trip like Eleanor Roosevelt has made? And do you think that any first lady can make that sort of trip today
I
into combat
don't.
zones, into dangerous, situations?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that any, I really do think that that quote of somebody at the time, the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made, still stands. The duration of what she did and also accomplishing what she did. So it's one thing to travel to the Pacific, but she didn't go in a vacuum. She then had these very wonderful platforms so that she could report in real time to the American people. And I think that that's really one of the crucial things because there were other people traveling to the Pacific theater, to the European theater. At the same time that Eleanor was in the Pacific, there were 5 senators who, the flying senators they were called, who actually took a private plane, whereas Eleanor was traveling in a military transport plane. And the 5 senators went around the world inspecting war areas in their private plane. So, what she's, but they don't have the means to report back to the American public like she did. And the other thing is, I think it would be very hard for first ladies to do this today because Eleanor refused Secret Service protection. In fact, she won a showdown with the Secret Service that she wanted to go around unprotected. She didn't want them with her. And she won that showdown. She did agree to the request to keep a gun in the glove box of her car. So I think she just wanted to go out. She didn't want anyone bothering her, like, and as far as the Secret Service presence, she just wanted to be out there among the American people and gathering her information, making change. And I think that would be difficult today. Like a first lady couldn't go out as freely as Eleanor did.
So you're saying that the whole time that she was on this trip, she had no Secret Service protection?
She did not have any Secret Service protection. She did fly with the same crew. So the same crew of the transport plane flew her out from San Francisco. She traveled in that same plane throughout the trip, except for when smaller aircraft or more secure aircraft were needed, like when she flew into Guadalcanal. And then she ended up flying in that plane back to New York. She was a little frustrated when she was in Australia because in Australia, they this high ranking army officers insisted on following her around everywhere. And she probably wished that they had done what the American reporter advised in the London newspaper: go through the necessary formalities and then just turn her loose. So she was never, she always had people with her.
Sure.
But yeah, she actually wished that there was a little bit less protection in Australia. Certainly. She just wanted to meet, as she said, ordinary servicemen and women and other people doing the war work. And that's what she wanted.
My goodness, what an extraordinary lady. Um, Shannon, was there any time? I can't was there any time? Was there any time during her trip when she was in danger?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that danger lurked in the Pacific theater. It was dangerous to be flying in the military transport plane. There are numerous instances of those planes crashing. In fact, one stop on Eleanor's itinerary was a rest stop for servicemen, and the military suppressed a very tragic transport crash there. And there was something like 40 something men on board, and all but one perished when this transport plane took off from this rest area in Australia and crashed. Also, Admiral Halsey got another thing that I used in my research and that was very critical were some Navy dispatches sent in real time during the trip. And they were at the National Archives. They were classified at the time, no longer classified. And in one, Admiral Halsey yelled at someone because they mistakenly said that Eleanor's plane had arrived at 2 a.m. instead of 2 p.m. because it was more dangerous to take off and land on these islands in the dark. And so yeah, there was all kinds of danger lurking. She like to say that she thought England was more dangerous than the Pacific because England was always kind of within reach of Hitler's raiders. But, you know, Guadalcanal was bombed several nights before and after her visit. And so she did go to the front lines, and she really wanted to do that. And one of the people that she had to convince was FDR. And he wanted her to make this trip. They just decided together that she would go to the Pacific. But he obviously, you know, understandably did not want her put in harm's way. So first she had to wear him down. And she did leave for the Pacific with letters from him saying that he was fine with her going to Guadalcanal if the commanders on the ground agreed. And then, of course, she had to convince Admiral Halsey.
I think you touched on this, but maybe there's some additions that you might want to bring up as well. But can you speak about any positive aspects of her trip that was had on the American war effort itself, aside from raising morale and helping with the war bond drives? I mean, was there anything like in particular that really advanced the American war effort because of the things that she was doing during the wartime period?
Well, I can't say that anything that she did say changed battles or, the course of military strategy or anything like that, because she was not involved in any day-to-day war planning or strategy with FDR and his advisors. Certainly, I think listening to the servicemen about what they needed and harping about the fact, not harping, that's a bad word, but, pressing home the fact that they need supplies to win the war. And that was true because Admiral Halsey grimly joked that in the beginning, the Pacific could have been called Operation Shoestring. So that was very important. And I think Eleanor just talking and talking about these issues in her public platforms did get some of this stuff done. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting is that she's touching on a lot of psychological issues for the home front. So I mentioned preparing the nation for the great number of men who would be returning with disabilities. She also recognized things from her hospital visits, the battle fatigue and shell shock that we now recognize, that we now know as PTSD. And she advised people on the home front that everybody had a responsibility to help returning fighters adjust to civilian life. She encouraged people to talk to their servicemen about their experiences. She relayed her experiences in the hospitals to FDR, and he advised the military commanders to pay more attention to this. And also, she's doing things like telling people on the home front not to send complaining letters to their servicemen because they never knew when the letter would be read. They could read it on the battlefield and become distracted. They could read it at a hospital bed and become despondent. And doctors told her that they could see men's recovery being affected sometimes if they were very downcast by news that they had received. So she was really playing this very interesting role in dealing with these kinds of psychological issues.
Yeah, it sounds like not only an interesting role, but a very fine line she was playing as well. And it sounds like she played it spectacular. I think there is one more question, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, sorry, two more. Did Eleanor get to visit any of her children while she was on this trip? You mentioned that four of her sons were serving during this time, one in particular in the Pacific. Did she get to meet or visit with any of them while she was there?
Eleanor did not see any of her children while she was in the Pacific. Her son James was a Marine who fought in the Solomon Islands campaign. He had been relocated to, I think he was in the Aleutian Islands at the time that she was in the Pacific. She did see the spot on the island where he had received a Navy Cross. So that was a very nice moment for her. When she went to England the year before, she did see one of her sons who was stationed there. And that was the other thing that when Eleanor went to England, her secretary and traveling companion went with her. She saw her son. She had friends in England. In the Pacific, she did not take her secretary and traveling companion because she wanted to try to cut down on the criticism. So she didn't, it's really her first extended trip without a close friend or family member with her. And that added to the isolation that she was feeling. And of course, the same for the troops. Mail took a while to catch up with her. So I think that she would loved to have seen her son James while she was in the Pacific, because he had gone through jungle warfare, and she talks about how he told her about hacking through the jungle and how it would take all night to go a half mile. And so she had heard about a lot of his experiences. But yeah, no, he was not in the Pacific when she was there.
I think this is our last question, if I'm not mistaken. I am mistaken. Do you have any other plans to do any other research on different aspects of Eleanor's life, or is this kind of like where you kind of leave everything off and maybe find a new research topic?
Yeah, no, I love this question too. And I actually would like to look into some of Eleanor's other travels, because after she left the White House, she went to work for the United Nations. And even after the United Nations, she was very involved globally. She kicked her travels into high gear really after her White House years. She was around the world numerous times, all the time. And so I would like to look into some of those other travels that she did post White House.
I won't jinx myself this time by saying this is our last question. And it is. So Eleanor broke many stereotypes of the day, as you had mentioned through your course of your conversation. In your research, did you find that she had role models that she was looking to inspire her to break these previous molds for limitations that had been placed on women at the time?
Yeah, so Eleanor, well, first of all, she went to school in England as a teenager, and there was a headmistress there who was very influential for Eleanor. And Eleanor had a very unhappy childhood. Her parents both died when she was very young. She lived in her grandmother's gloomy household. She talks about how she was afraid of everything. She was afraid of the dark. She was afraid of displeasing people. And she went to this school where she was really empowered by this headmistress. And Eleanor really credits her with a strong mind, liberal values. She said that everything that she became had those seeds in this time with this headmistress. And I love that the headmistress told them, why do you have a mind if not to use it? And for Eleanor, coming from this very upper crust family that was very into conformity, they were aghast when Eleanor came home and started volunteering at a tenement on the Lower East Side of New York City. And I love that when Eleanor was in Wellington, she was giving a speech at a theater, an audience full of women. And a reporter in the audience said that Eleanor seemed like a modern crusader and that her weapons were a microphone and a typewriter. And all I could think of, and I tied this instance there in the book, is that Eleanor's grandmother once told her, a woman's place is not in the public eye. And so just from there, you can see where Eleanor came from, the expectations of a woman of her class at that time, and how she just moved light years beyond that. And she really credited this headmistress, Mademoiselle Souvestre, as a pivotal influence.
Awesome. And then if you could remind us, please, Shannon, where can we pick this book up at? I'm sure many of our audience members are really intrigued now and would like to read it.
Well, good. I hope so. It can be had at any major online retailer. I'm sure if your local bookstore is not carrying it, they can order it for you. And there are links on my website, which is shannonmckennaschmidt.com.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Shannon. It was a fantastic talk, lots of great information, and just a whole new, area of history that we really don't look at here at the museum. And it just kind of, I'm sure some of us on here will be like a little more curious about how we start finding these other aspects that aren't really talked about very much or written about very much, but that are so consequential to not only the war efforts that we've seen in the past, but also moving forward as well.
Yes. Well,
We're
thank
getting
you
lots of
so
positive
much.
comments here in the chat.
Oh, good. Well,
Everybody loved your presentation.
oh, well, thank you so much. And the Q&A was great. So I thank everyone very much. I had a wonderful time.
Well, excellent. Thank you again, Shannon. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today as well. It's always great to have everybody come back. I see a lot of familiar names. And so it's just great to be able to have these book talks come back. And don't forget, next Tuesday night is the next trivia night. So if you are interested in our trivia programming, we'd love to see you out there Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. And of course, you can always find all of our other events on our website, wisbetsmuseum.com. Thank you again, everybody. And thank you, Shannon. I hope everybody has a great